Hey guys, so today let's talk about something I just realized, which is accepting something's nature, right? Because I was watching this video about this girl and she was talking about like just all her empowerment and just it was an interesting video, right? Now she hit this one part where she started talking about how she, went through a celibacy phase because, she was being super promiscuous and that she enjoyed sort of this being this a fantasy of this sort of elusive, desired woman from all these men, but then realized she was all constantly in situations where there was this built expectation, right? And it was this feeling of obligation. So she went on this sort of celibacy journey and then cut it off. And then, she opened back up the floodgates and now she has like boundaries and can say no and yada, 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 yada. And it was very interesting. Like she talked about like how, she wishes men were more like this and how like she can't act a certain way around certain men and certain relationships because it can't be this way and that they should be able to do something, but they're not. And I had this sort of thought because at first I started being critical of her. I started thinking to myself, like, well, okay, well, first off, because in my mind, my perspective was that, okay, this is just someone who's enjoying a bunch of attention, who's using their feminine ability to get attention, to sort of validate their own existence. But when they fall onto the sort of the back end of that, which is when you build an expectation with people, and you kind of got to pay the piper, then you got to really analyze whether or not you're committed or dedicated to something, or if you're just enjoying a process for a while, right? Kind of like this idea of, let's say I'm really, really desperate, and so I'll pick a job up, but I don't really enjoy that job. The job, will help get me through a tough time or whatever, but then when I'm done with my need for it, I will then, kind of move on and be like, oh, I didn't really care about that job. And I think sometimes, like, you can treat a job like that. People will treat relationships like that, where this relationship will sort of serve to fill an emotional need that is temporary, but you're filling a temporary need by giving like a more permanent set of obligations. Now we know, obviously, if you're going to grow and be successful and be able to live in this world as tumultuous as it is, we have to understand that most human nature, people aren't going to follow through their word and be consistent, right? It's just a lot of what's in human nature, because a lot of people are surviving and talking in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, most people will say or do anything they can to survive. But then once they're out of survival mode, suddenly their values come back. And then, you start being revealed who you are. The nature of your character comes out. So I was being critical of this girl, but then I started thinking to myself, okay, what does it mean to really, what's the ideal here? What would you ideally do? Well, the ideal is that you would set an expectation with someone and you'd follow through with it because you want to follow through on that expectation because you want to. And I've been thinking about how this extends outside of relationships. So say, for instance, like I want to write a book. I have to write every day if I want to write a book. Now, if I don't enjoy the process of writing, it begs the question, why do I want to write a book? Because if I'm writing a book in order to get something, like that book is a means to an end, I realized love does not function that way. Love is in and of itself the means. And when I started realizing that and seeing that, she was talking about how there's love and there's love everywhere and how you can do things and you kind of like pixie dream girl or whatever. And I do think there's something to loving the universe and the universe taking care of you and trusting that and having faith. I don't know if that's the fully defined, I don't know if that's the full vision of love. If love was a 4-letter word, I think that's just the first 2 letters, like L-O. But there's another part to it. There's more than just being able to like love the universe, but I think also like when you come to love individual parts of the universe, you don't judge. You don't judge, but I'm realizing more and more should becomes something I think of less and less. As I've been in my most loving moments, and when I've learned to accept people and to truly forgive them, how I know I've really loved someone is when I've forgiven them. Because I especially, there was someone who'd hurt me. I kind of had my heart broken the other day. And just recently, I was just able to sort of feel this release from her. And it wasn't because I didn't care about her, but it was because I realized that I could just accept her nature for what she was. And I recognized there was aspects of her nature that hurt me and that created pain in me. And that's what created and needed that distance, because obviously I love and care about myself. But I realized the distance wasn't a punishment for her or me. It was more in order that I could love her and appreciate her as she was. And I realized it was just recognizing that at some point these two forces mingled, but when there was this level of closeness, they didn't. So they had to naturally find their natural distance, and that's what allowed me to love her. And I realized not wanting to change her or not wishing she was anything different than her nature, that's when I was like, oh, I'm really loving her, right? And I'm realizing that's what it is. Now, going back to the book analogy, you might be like, okay, so if I love and accept everything for what it is, that means like if someone accepts and loves themselves and other people, they should do that. So this is when we start talking about obligations and duties. And that's when I start realizing, like, I think the final E at the end of love that nobody talks about, but I'm starting to realize is becoming very important, is this idea of devotion. Because I've realized, like, devotion, I think, is probably one of the highest levels and forms of love. Because when I speak of devotion, and I've talked about it in a few other videos, but I'm going to keep talking about it. The movie Devotion was actually one of the most impactful movies I'd ever watched. And I didn't think anything of it until the end. And now I think about that movie all the time. I've only ever seen it once. But it showed me like what it really means to be devoted, and like why I think it's the highest form of love. Because when you love something and you're devoted to something, you seek its betterment entirely for its own sake, even to the point where you will go through, I want to say sacrifice, but sacrifice is not the word, because the sacrifice means to give up something like as though for something better, but it's even more potent than that. It's literally to decide to walk through something's process with it. Like, to love something is to watch a flower bloom, not just to see the end result of the beautiful flower, but to desire and support it through every aspect and part of its blooming. And that means sometimes you get involved. That means sometimes you don't. You have to keep your hands back to allow the flower to bloom and become the best thing it can be. So not only to love something, you have to be committed to it, but you also have to be able to see it and accept its nature, right? You have to know its nature. So that's where love becomes more than a feeling. It actually becomes like a knowledge, a curiosity, an understanding of like, hey, how does this thing really exist? And then when you come to understand its nature, it's accepting its nature. And then obviously creating the appropriate amount of space. Like, I can love a snake, but it doesn't mean I'm going to get close to it, especially if it's venomous, because it might hurt me. But it doesn't mean I don't love it. I can just understand its nature and respect that if I get close to this dude, it's going to bite the hell out of me and kill me. And I recognize that also goes the reverse for like, when you say like, when people will be like, I love women, or like, they'll want women, but it's like, how can you love somebody but not accept their own nature? And I'm starting to realize like all the people that I love, like I think of all these people that have hurt me, but I realize like I have to let go of what I think they should have been. Now there's some things I would have liked for them to be. There's some things that, man, this would have been great. And maybe in the best version of themselves, I see them being that way. But in order for that to happen, I have to be able to sit with them and be present. And I realize that's the key. Presence. Being present with their nature. And being willing to accept that this phase of their growth might be painful for me. It might hurt me. But if I really love them, I will either create the amount of distance to give them the space they need to grow, or I will sit there and sucker that pain for them. And that's when you start talking about like this highest form of unconditional love, because then you realize it is about truly accepting someone or something's nature. And I realize we can't ask others to accept our nature without the willingness to accept their own. And I realize part of what makes a relationship or anything work isn't because one side kowtows to the other. I think what it is that when you truly see the other person and you see yourself, or you see writing, or you see anything, when you truly understand it and you recognize and appreciate its nature, it's recognizing that in order for a book to be written, every single word from the beginning all the way to the end and everything in the middle has to be put down. The story has to be told. So regardless of how I feel about that process, if I truly want to see this thing come to shape, I will learn to enjoy this process because you're in love with it. And I come to see when you naturally love things, when you love something, when you truly love something, you enjoy the process of its growth, even if it's difficult, even if it's hard. And I realize, like, as I'm coming to learn to and like truly love myself, and I see all the shortcomings or the weaknesses I have, or that I see in myself, I also see it in others. But there's this acceptance of recognizing, like, this is them on their journey, and I wouldn't want it any other way, right? And it's really easy when we detach from the things in our lives. Like when you see it as a personal character, like a character on a movie screen or in a television show, it becomes really easy to recognize why appreciating someone's shortcomings and observing them and being present with them through their story is so important. This is why it's so easy to personally love characters, because we're not necessarily personally affected. There's this level of distance. But the thing is, if we can show that same level of, not necessarily distance, but that same level of discernment and recognizing that the people in our lives also require and need that very same space that we give to television characters, book characters, like even hobbies that we need to do. If we can give people that level of space and grace, man, I think that's when love can really start to shine. And so I started just realizing, like, just from watching this woman's video, that like, oh wow, because I was being critical, like, oh man, like I don't even really think she loves these guys, right? Because it sounds like she's just using them for attention. But then I started like turning it back on myself and being like, okay, well, like, if you see that in her, like, what does that mean for you? And I started realizing, like, oh, like when it's writing, or if it's reading a book, or it's living my life, like truly living my life, it's understanding the highs and the lows are all part of the grand symphony. It's all part of the same deal. And that to pick and choose it is to slice it up. It's as though to ignore the flower while it's growing and only appreciate it when it's at the end. But it's recognizing everything that happened in between is what led to that final product. But when you really love something, you're not just looking for the final product. You're enjoying that journey. You're enjoying that process. And so as I've come to understand, like, loving writing, loving my journey, loving my purpose is more of that. It's a devotion. And when I think of devotion, it's that. Like the guy in the movie, he went and he crashed the plane for, spoiler alert, by the way, if you haven't seen the movie Devotion, right? But the dude goes and he crashes his airplane to save his partner. And part of that was meaning he was present through that journey. He was present with him through that journey. And he couldn't save him. He was unable to save him. And that's when you realize, like, love isn't about saving anybody, right? Like, love, when you love that flower, the flower grows regardless of whether or not you're there. But your being there allows the flower to be witnessed in its growth. And I've realized, like, that's what I've wanted. And I realize part of that is also recognizing that in others and being able to appreciate their own growth. And even if there's painful parts or things that are unpleasant temporarily to me, I can still appreciate and recognize that this person has made growth. this person has more growth to become, perhaps, as I see them, but it's ultimately being present enough and willing to stay present in the journey. And sometimes that you don't need to be vocal about that. Sometimes you don't need to be vocal about that presence. Sometimes you don't need to make it known to the other person. Sometimes just witnessing is being enough, and then being available when it's important, when it's necessary. Because everyone's always in their own journey of love. And so that was a thought. And so I was thinking like, okay, so I can accept this girl for who she is and what she says. And I can see like a bunch of ways where it's like, oh, as she understands love, she's going to have to recognize that if I truly want to be friends with these guys, you can't go around criticizing their nature. But then it's also like her coming to maybe to understanding like what it is she's actually looking for in a relationship, right? But once again, like I'm not here to play psychologist with anybody. So it was just kind of understanding and seeing that. And I wanted to share and talk about that today because it really hit me today, like why acceptance is one of the highest forms of love and how we can master that. So leave any thoughts you guys have in the comments. It was a bit longer than I thought it was going to be, but I just had to get that off my chest. And I think acceptance is one of the highest forms of love, or it's on the path, certainly. You must accept in order to love. So that's the message for the day. Anyway, hope all is well. Take care, peace, stay happy, stay healthy.